kind of people are entrepreneurs on your side of the house?
The kind of people that are entrepreneurs on our side of the house are obviously, we're not going to defend a world in which no people are entrepreneurs. That would be ludicrous. And obviously this is something that is rather murky and difficult to define. But what we are saying is that given that social phenomena exist in glorifying a culture means that more people are going to do this. We're perfectly fine defending that sure some people do it, but we would prefer that less people do it and more people go into traditional career paths. Obviously it's very difficult to pinpoint that in an exact way. So given that, now let's talk about traditional career paths as in like a cross and why we think that this is better. So obviously there's things like financial security in a lot of ways. Financial security is something that's incredibly important, not just for obviously being able to feed yourself and possibly a family that you have, but in a lot of ways of like internal well-being. The fact that having financial security and job security can reduce your stress levels or immeasurably. It can add more like even like life expectancy and quality of life. Your quality of life is very likely to improve. All things that we think are just going to make you a much more likely to be a happy person. Something I think is honestly like you cannot weigh enough in this round, given how widespread and prevalent depression and a lot of like internal feelings of that are important. So things like that. But we think that the other thing is that you're also probably going to be very likely be satisfied anyway with a job in a corporate structure, is because within a corporate structure, there's still oftentimes a whole lot of ground for innovation and the like. And the reason why we think that there's a whole lot of room for innovation, competition, and creativity is because you still want to have in the corporation structures competition between them and other corporations. So it necessarily makes sense for corporations to have a breeding ground for creativity, to have a breeding ground for these kinds of things. So this means you're very likely still going to be able to be doing a lot of the same things that you would be doing in a startup anyway. We think the primary difference that you're getting at is that you're going to be able to do a lot of the same things that you'd be doing with your life. The big difference is that you get things like financial security, you get things like job security, all things that we think are going to be incredibly well. But the final thing that I want to talk about is I want to talk about the internal feelings of anguish that you can get if you ultimately see your startup fail, which is something that we think is rather likely. Because recognize that it's incredibly damaging to you emotionally in a lot of ways when you put your life possibly into something, when you put like years of your life possibly, a lot of your time and your brain power, and a whole lot of money and investment energy into something, and it ultimately just doesn't pan out. This is something that could be incredibly destructive for you. And you know what? Maybe some people are prepared to take the risk, but I would argue that most people are not, and the process of glorification makes more people take that risk when at the end of the day, they shouldn't take that risk. So, for those reasons, we're incredibly proud to close.
Thank you, panelists, for your speech. The likely by leader of the opposition, reserve pronouncement.
The problem with Danny's case is that almost every harm he illustrates for startups is non-unique to you pursuing business in that way. If you get rejected for a job interview, even though you have the qualifications, if you went to school but there aren't jobs in your field, if you live in a neighborhood where jobs are being moved to somewhere else, you don't have job security, you don't have good feelings, you don't have money that you can take care of your family with. I'm going to give you a series of pieces of rebuttal to the case that we get out of opening government, and then I have 3 pieces of constructive for you on the positive benefits of startup culture, why only glamorization is a benefit in this world. I want to talk about refutation first. So the first thing they tell you is that like people go into this out of a desire to achieve social status, and that glorification means they are more likely to do this. You have to ask yourselves what the comparative is. More likely than what? The fact is that glorification is the only pushback we have against a society that tells you you have to enter traditional careers. Careers that are often pigeonholed based on your race, your gender, your age, or what other people perceive you to be regardless of your talent. Admittedly, all of the problems that Danny points out are possible, though he cannot guarantee the benefits he claims. The thing about it is that in the absence of glorification, people are unlikely to be willing to test the waters in a world that is just as difficult as the career world, especially if you are from a disadvantaged group. Secondly, they tell you it's really hard to secure investors, you're probably going to fail because you don't have the skills. Two responses to this, right? The first is that hard to secure is not a reason not to do it, nor is it unique to the startup process. It is rather hard to get an interview at a good paying job. It is only easy when the job is easy itself, and in that case the competition is quite stiff because anyone else could do it. So I would argue you actually have a marginally better chance of gaining income in our world. Secondly though, people often start startups based on a series of skills they already have. They find an absence of reception for the skills they have in the work market. They find an absence of positions for them, and so they say, you know what, I could be my own boss. I know how to sell this skill. I've been successful at it before. That's why quite a number of women who enter the startup market, including now what is a rather prominent stall in borough market in London, are things like women who had success catering but weren't paid enough because that is a male-dominated career and decided to be their own bosses and price things the way they deserve to be priced and get the respect they deserved. Then they tell you your quality of life improves. Look, you just straight up cannot guarantee that, right? You can only guarantee that in a world where opening or closing government can guarantee you the best possible job. I don't think they're going to be able to prove that. They tell you there's lots of room for innovation in a regular company. The reason that large companies do things like nap pods or breaks or 60-80 splits in whether you have creative and working time is because they are resistant to startup culture, which presented them with those ideas that are not traditional to the workplace otherwise. They are incorporating what the best elements of their opposition is. I think they wouldn't have been like that absent the glorification that made many people pursue startups. Okay, so into constructive then. The first thing I want to talk about is innovation. Innovation occurs best in the marketplace when many individuals pursue profit on their own terms for a number of reasons. First, you are not under a company's long-term plan. Recognize that though you may potentially have the job security they argue on opening government, at best what you are is a foot soldier in the larger plan of a company that you are not privy to the inner workings of. That means that at best your innovation is quite low level, you are likely to feel that that is not taken seriously, and you have about not even a 50-50 chance of that being incorporated into the way that your company works. Absent that, the other thing is that most of the profit in startups accrues to you yourself. So the incentive to work hard and work creatively and find workarounds is actually quite high because you don't have that incentive to go on Facebook for 20 minutes during the workday because that's 20 minutes of money you're taking away from yourself. It's really hard to feel that way when you're guaranteed a paycheck because someone else is doing the difficult work, or at least you can pretend that someone else is doing the difficult work. So I think actually innovation is both more responsible and much more likely to feel like it's happening when you are working on your own company. Secondly though, new ideas are not just about brilliance, right? They are also about strategy and planning, and that is something that happens when you feel responsible for the task. So when they tell you you are likely to be quite anguished and find it difficult because you're responsible for the success of your company, Aislin and I would argue for you that that is in fact quite a motivating factor for many people in a way that is simply absent when someone else runs your job. It's much more likely that your startup is something you believe in. I think that's important. Sure.
In any given year, more than 90% of startups fail. Why do you believe that everyone is going to do better in this environment when empirically the vast majority don't?
Oh, so let's take closing at their absolute best. Even if not every startup fails, I'm going to give you two more pieces of constructive that tell you why just the effort of having that is good for producing agency in groups that otherwise are quite trapped by the market, and is good for producing better business for the people who do get jobs in the boring corporate workforce. Okay, so what is the comparative in this round, right? Where else do people go when startup culture is just not that appealing? Two possible responses. One is graduate school. Recognize that it is quite likely that you enter into an advanced degree for something like history or English that doesn't necessarily have an immediate payout, nor does it necessarily have a better job market given the current conditions in education. But secondarily, even if you're super talented at that, the workforce that is derived from that, research positions and university administrative positions, is as cutthroat, if not more cutthroat, because there just isn't the same turnover. So even if they tell you that startups have a high turnover from failure, I'd argue that that makes quite a bit of room for people to be entering this quite a bit less unemployment, because it's possible for you to try and try again in a way that critical failure in a high pressure career is not. Second thing they could do is go into traditional careers. Look, they are often highly restrictive, often gendered, and the gap in pay matters particularly here. Because in startups, profit is decided by whether you can convince someone of your tangible, visible success. But when I go to a business school interview, it matters very much whether I'm wearing a skirt or pants to that interview, whether I went to Wharton, and what race I am. I think that when you can sell, even if you dislike the commodification, when you have the opportunity to sell cultural emblems or things that you were raised with, when you are able to market things that you have talent for, I think that that is much more appealing. It gives minority groups shut out of the corporate workforce a sense of agency and ability, and a sense that people recognize and are willing to pay for things that they care about and have in their homes. Aislin and I want to leave you with a vision of startups that admits that not everyone is successful, but to remind you that that is also the case in a traditional workforce that tells certain people they are completely unvaluable except as a foot soldier in someone else's project. Yes, being your own boss is difficult, but for some people, this is the only chance for that they ever get.
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition, for the speech. The light you like at Prime Minister with preferred pronunciation. Hear from answer.
Ready? I think the opening opposition paints a rather rosy picture of what glorification actually looks like and who is impacted by these things. Because if you look at tangible examples of how glorification works and who is held up for the standards of what is possible, it's not a diverse range of individuals from interesting backgrounds. It's people that have been able to be fortunate enough to be in very successful positions like Harvard or go to other successful universities. And they're also overwhelmingly white and male. People, if you look at instances of the media that we talk about, like Silicon Valley is an instance of 4 dudes that are able to use their past beneficial degrees in order to get a leg up. And they don't talk about how, even if you have this type of glorification, which is overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male, it doesn't mean that any of the barriers get broken down that have prevented people like women and minorities from entering the tech industry or anything of the like. Which means that it compounds on what Danny has already told you, that people are given a false message about what is in the status quo currently possible and are set up for immense failure. On top of all of this, what is unique about the startup business from any other position is that if you spend 4 years of your life trying to develop an idea, trying to get venture capitalists to put money into your idea, trying to bring that idea to market, and then at the end of the day you found out that 2 months ago someone brought the exact same idea to market, and now that since that's happened, the 4 years of your life that you put forward is a waste, that you have no work to show for it, there's no actual potential for progress that exists in other comparable fields. What I mean by this is that, yeah, maybe it's hard and maybe it's cutthroat to go to grad school, or maybe if you're like a cog in a machine at some corporation, yeah, maybe you don't think that you're putting as much work into these things, that you have as much agency over that, though I think that there are opportunities for agency and such, which I'll get to later. But the difference is you have possibilities for advancement. You have financial security that allows you to have more time for yourself, to develop other aspects of yourself outside of that corporate culture, outside of just your profession. And it means that you have possibilities for advancement. You can use a grad school degree to go into a number of fields, not just academia, and maybe you're a cog in a corporate machine for 2 years after you get out of college, but that doesn't mean that 3, 4, 5 years down the line after you put work in, you can't get opportunities for advancement. We think those opportunities for advancement in established fields are probably more likely to be areas in which you can actually get a diversity of individuals and not just these same white males that continue perpetually propped up by this glorification. We think that on our side of the house, you get on our side of the house, you don't get people going to these fields that otherwise wouldn't have worked. My main piece of extension is how we actually think we get more innovation on our side of the house and why that's possible. Firstly, I would contest what we get out of the yellow, I'll take you a little later. I would contest what we get out of the yellow, that the only reason that startups have things like nap time, or not startups, corporations have things like nap times and the ability to have more creative time that isn't structured is simply because there are startups that they have to compete with. This is not the case. The reason that this is the case is because there are a number of large multinational corporations that have many branches and divisions that simply the top of the organization, like Google and Apple, can't oversee the many divisions that they need to try and put products out from. So what I mean by this is Google works on search engines, it works on maps, it works on VR, it works on dozens of other industries. And in order to both attract the best talent from these other corporations, so attract talent away from Apple or away from Amazon or whatnot, and in order to create the best products, they can't just have their hands over these people and directing them in every which way. So in order to get success in these particular fields, you need to breed an environment that allows for innovation. What are the unique ways in which innovation is more successful on our side of the house? First, you have the actual infrastructure structure that allows for you to pay for these products and to pay for these ideas, which allows you to focus your time not on trying to reach out to venture capitalists, but instead on actually focusing on the thing that you're passionate about. Secondly, it allows for you, it doesn't force you to try and bring a product to market as quickly as possible. What do I mean by this? Many times people that have startups or ideas or starting a startup, they don't have an entire business model planned out, they don't have an entire product ready to go. Rather, they have something like an algorithm or a platform, and then they want to go and put that thing out into the world, but they don't actually have an idea of how they're going to do that, which means when you have people in startups, because in order to actually be profitable and to attract venture capitalists, you need to have a product, sell and make money from to pay back those venture capitalists, you're forced to try and push an idea out as quickly as possible, which means we actually think the innovation they get on their side of the house compared to where you have a more sheltered corporate environment on our side of the house is one in which the innovation you get is much worse. We don't think that you get people that don't have things that they're passionate about, things that they want to improve, things they want to look into the world and say, this is something I need to fix. We think you just get that instead in the corporate environment in a way that allows that idea to be nurtured and made better moving forward from that.
Google, Apple, Facebook were all startups that provide a huge bulk of the traditional jobs that you're talking about people taking. Where would those jobs have come up without those people starting their own businesses that weren't popular at the time?
So this round is not, do startups need to exist at all? This round is, should we glorify and get more people to go into these businesses than otherwise would have occurred? Also, if you look at places like Apple, Google, Facebook, they were started by people that had other means of trying to be successful. So if Mark Zuckerberg had flamed out and Facebook has never been successful, he still had that degree that he could fall back on and the traditional corporate structure to go into. But the problem is when you have individuals that think, oh, I can program, now I can go and avoid college, I can go and avoid other things that might be a way of making money in the short term, they don't have those same things to fall back on. And furthermore, we don't think that startups just disappear on our side of the house. Like, we're not going to contest that, like, if you don't have glorification, all these things go away. What we do think you get on our side of the house without glorification is that every single person with a 2-bit idea that thinks, hey, my thing might be original, those people don't suddenly jump into this scene and try and get their ideas out there. Furthermore, what do we again think you get uniquely when you go through the corporate structure? As I have already said, most people don't have the business ideas, the ability to market, the ability to bring in the correct personnel to actually sell their ideas, which means that when you have people, even with good ideas, it's very difficult for them to market those ideas or actually be able to put those ideas out there without a corporate platform. The reason for this is they're simply not specialized in these things. When you enter a corporate platform, your specialization is empowered by the specialization of those around you, which means when you get innovative ideas on our side of the house, which I don't think opposition can tell you all of a sudden people aren't going to have ideas. I think that's kind of ludicrous. If they're able to go into this corporate world where we've already told you there's an environment where you need to bring some sort of innovation to the table, because if you don't, other people are going to, and you're going to be shut out. Given that this is the case, we think you're more likely to get people empowered by these corporate atmospheres. So if I'm a programmer and I have an idea, I don't need to spend my time worrying about where I'm going to get my money, how I'm going to market my product, who's going to be on my board of directors, or anything like that. I can focus on how I'm going to improve the world the best. I can focus on how to make my idea the most impactful it can possibly be. On their side of the house, this is distracted by a number of other issues, and at the end of the day, because you're probably not going to find a venture capitalist that's going to fund you, all those things are going to be for naught. On our side of the house, we don't take on any of that risk, and we get actually more innovation. For those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad, for speaking. I'd like to invite the leader of all of the preferred pronunciation. Here.
Honorable Speaker, opening government is quite right to point out that both things that we're talking about will exist either side of the house. So we will have people who want to start companies, and we will have people who want to go into traditional career paths. It's about whether or not the recent glorification of startups has been good on net or bad. We've given you the case that the existent glorification was of things like a university education and going into corporations that were largely dominated by individuals that had the kind of capital that were given through historic inaccuracies of merit that existed for a long time. So that was things that underwrote people of different races, people like women, etc. What we're saying is this is a massive pushback such that people who are currently shut out of those kinds of career paths understand that it is possible to succeed themselves. One further thing I'd like to note is that we don't need to tell you that everyone's going to make the next Google. There are a massive number of niche corporations that individuals are able to corner that are not as profitable as the people that went to Harvard would ever invest in. Those are the kinds of companies we get when people understand that they can corner a market that has been ignored, probably because the rich people that they're talking about never bothered to care about them because they never lived in a place that would benefit from it. A number of things I'm going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit more about innovation, tell you why we get the best kind of innovation and most needed innovation. Second, I'm going to talk to you about why that diversity is important, doing all the clash that ended up happening, and then I'll rebut some extraneous pieces. So let's talk about innovation, because I think Lex gave you a number of important reasons as to why innovation is better served on our side of the house. But I'd like to give you a few more. First of all, I think that individuals who haven't belonged to a corporate culture that has a rollout map of, let's say, the next 5 years are more likely to pursue things that are important. So let's give you an example. If Google has spent a lot of money developing a product, but they have a new idea that's slightly better, their incentive is to keep that under wraps, roll out their first one, then 5 years down the line, roll out the next one, so that they can profit off of both of them. If they have the competition of a startup who has that idea, who is able to pitch it, they either have to roll out that product now, which we still think is good, even if it ends up shutting out that startup because those kinds of things are available to the public. Or they have an incentive to do things like, I don't know, buy out that startup in the first place, if it is such a good idea. That forces that company not to have a monopoly over the kinds of innovation that ends up existing, and forces them to be ones that respond to the demands of individuals and good ideas generally. But then also what's important is that I think it actually ends up being disruptive to those monopolies and oligopolies because they have to make new products and can't just rely on ads. Critically, what this has done, even for those companies, which is where they want people to work, is it means they have to consistently be scouting people that they wrote off before. So those are people who don't have a university degree, who they previously wouldn't have employed, but now because they know that they've been burned before by the creation of massive corporations on the basis of individuals who were like that, they consistently have to give credit to ideas from people they didn't expect before, lest those become competition in the future to them. That means tons more outreach on the basis of those companies, even if you believe that individuals want to work there. So if you believe that traditional jobs are good, startup culture and the glorification of it has actually made it better and more accepting. But finally, and they have different incentives from companies, and this is critical. Startups who do not necessarily have the incentive to corner an entire global market, but who are able to access specific niches, like perhaps they have a problem with getting people in low-income housing, the kinds of services or perhaps food that they end up needing. People who are from those particular areas who understand that that is something that is necessary and that is something that is profitable for a niche group of people are much more likely to do so when they understand that they don't have to get a traditional degree and aspire to be a part of Google, which doesn't end up serving that particular community. The incentives for them to do so come first from perhaps wanting to give back, but second because if they were shut out perhaps from that company in the first place. So I think it is likely that those individuals do end up innovating in ways that were not previously done before because they were not as profitable as to be important for a company like Google. That's better innovation. No thanks. Then in terms of the access to greater diversity of people, we get a challenge from open in government, which is that these kinds of startup companies only really come from people who already had a cushion. Those are individuals who necessarily are able to take risks and things like that. A number of problems with this. First of all, I think that there are a number of people that end up succeeding. Lex dealt with that. For the people who don't end up succeeding, some of them are bought out. So when you say that the startup had failed, it's because they don't own it anymore. That is still net good. Those people make money. The people who have their ideas, but somebody else had it further, that now doesn't mean that they don't have access to jobs. That means that they're actually a better candidate for a company like Google because they have the proven skills that they were able to code in that way. Especially if somebody else had that idea and they are profitable, it is in the incentive of Google to do things like approach the individual who also had a similar one, have them work for them. So even if you like traditional jobs, these people who were shut out are more likely to be seen on our side of that particular house. And then even the people who get absolutely none of that, it is unlikely that they ever had the money or the capital to sink and invest lots into that particular project in the first place. At the very least, they did not put that money into a university degree that has largely been set up to make them go into a massive amount of debt with completely unclear outcomes at the end because of structural, racial, gender, etc. barriers to the companies that you are talking about. So on the comparative, if you are weighing them up, it is much more likely that these individuals have more options because there is at least a balance of the asymmetry of the view of what is something that is profitable or what is something that has cachet of the elite. I'll take that.
if it's the case that somebody has invested lots of time and money into trying to build up a startup, likely they took out loans. At the end, if they fail, they get nothing for that. If they took out loans to go to college, they got a degree, which is comparatively better given that 90% fail, not get bought out.
No, because here's the thing, it's whether or not you think that the degree itself is a better indication of the skills that they're trying to get into that particular company. And I actually think that if you've taken out a loan and proven that you are able to create, that is a more applicable proof of that particular skill. That degree isn't relevant anymore. But also recognize we're not just talking about tech companies, we're also talking about things like giving services to other individuals. We're talking about things like, I don't know, making food more accessible to people who live in food deserts. If you create something that means that individuals are able to access those other sorts of things. So that university degree, not necessarily important, and maybe it's more important for you as an individual to end up competing on that particular thing. So, what we ended up hearing finally from these is that these individuals who have companies are better able to make the best products because they have a big cushion. It's definitely possible that that happens. Who makes that push more important? It's the startups that have now become a viable competition to their bottom line. That's what's critically important. So at the end of the day, what you ought to take from open in government is a team that understands that both of these things will exist on either side of the house. That weighs that it is more important that they are both seen as valuable, such that the people who already believe the things about stability, about the wages, that have tried to get into those companies but now don't have the option to do so, now understand also that there is another way for them to pursue things that are not seen as viable, etc. So in terms of the likelihood, these people now just have more options rather than being shut out in one and not having the option to exist in the other. It's made companies better, startups have been good, and it's on that basis we beg to oppose.
Thank you, the leader of opposition for the speech, and likely by a member of the government referred now.
Are we all ready? Awesome. The opening opposition conception of startup culture is incredibly strange. What we get simultaneously is that here are a list of things that startups could do. Startups could really benefit the gender balance in Silicon Valley, even though empirically we know that men far dominate tech startup industries. They could be better than universities because they're not as racist, even though we know universities have affirmative action programs and startups see incredibly few and small numbers of people of color. They could, the DLO alludes to this idea that there's so many small startups in the world that can actually help very small parts of the economy. They can help those who are underprivileged. But the examples that we continuously hear are Google, are Facebook. The glamorization that we find so problematic is not startups in themselves. It's this idea of a startup founder, a Mark Zuckerberg, an Elon Musk, that is an individual that can lead an entire company to success, and that individual gets rich. We don't glamorize these individuals because they help society. We glamorize these individuals because angel investors come to them, give them a lot of money, and rob what we believe to be the most central tenets of the rest of our lives. So before I get into the actual two extensions I want to bring up, I want to rebut a little bit of the stuff that OG didn't get to. First, I'll take your question.
The glorification of startup culture is the culture overall, not just like the figureheads that we attach to that thing.
That's true, but the way we conceive of startups is not, here's a big team that did something really well. It's whenever we think of a Facebook innovation, we think of Mark Zuckerberg. That's the culture we find so problematic. But even if CEO does want to claim that it's the culture that we think of and not the individuals, I'll go on later to explain why even the workers themselves are abused in startup culture. So let's talk about this idea that university degrees are worse and that the corporate life is worse. First, a glance at the empirics I've already given you, that we know for a fact that there are a lot of affirmative action policies, for example, that there's much more equitable distribution of hiring in both universities and corporate culture, when we know for a fact that Silicon Valley has an incredibly high degree of white males that are oftentimes privileged, oftentimes come from very privileged backgrounds. The second response, though, is that recognize in order for a startup to succeed, you don't go appeal to an HR department in the way you would get a traditional job. HR departments are much more in tune with, for example, avoiding subconscious sexism, subconscious racism. When you go to a white dude that made millions off of Wall Street and is now looking to invest into the technological scene, they are much more likely to be racist. They are much more likely to be sexist. In fact, we would posit to you that that is the root cause of the demographic problems in Silicon Valley. That's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about the extensions, though. The first thing I want to talk about is the way we think startup cultures hurt the individual. The second thing I want to talk about, which for some reason has not been in the round yet, is how startup cultures hurt the economy. The first thing, then, is how this distorts the perception of success for people on the ground. I've already alluded to the fact that startup culture promulgates a conception of success as individual, that individuals are the firebrands and the trailblazers that create success in the future, when we know for a fact that throughout history, success has been created by groups of individuals working for a like-minded cause the exact same advocacy for success that traditional companies construct. Moreover, though, we think the incredibly toxic perception of success comes in the way of work-life balance. OO is wrong. The reason Google and Facebook mandate such ideas as like, this is when you work, this is when you nap, this is when you eat, is because they're imitating startup culture. And the existence of startup culture forces a race to the bottom for traditional companies that must imitate their methods in order to continuously exacerbate the efforts of their workers. This, moreover, means, though, that whenever an entrepreneur or a potential entrepreneur wants to succeed, they believe they have to devote 90% of their time, 95% of their time to work, and this, we think devalues the importance of other parts of your life. This is what we think front half is missing. That they've talked so much about money, but we think that there's a harmful psychological implication when all of your expectations are that you sink all of your money, all of your time into this exact idea, and as Andrew's POI elucidates, you don't get anything after that. At least we know when you get a college degree, you can make $1 million more over your lifetime. That is something substantial. When nearly 95% of startups fail, though, not get poached, fail, and the other 4% get poached, and only 1% of them actually succeed, that is failure. That is awful. What's up?
Okay, so why is it better for an Indian worker to aspire to a large company rather than start a company at home they see a niche for that the glorification has increased the chances of funding for?
Because when you work for a large company, and this is the second half of my second extension, those large companies bring more benefits to their workers. They bring more benefits to the communities that they themselves on opposition bench are trying to help. The next part I want to talk about, though, in terms of the impact on the individual, is the way it glamorizes risk-taking. Recognize that Peter Thiel himself wanted kids to not go to school. He started a fund for scholarships that stated if you pledge to not fucking go to college, you could create your own startup. But then we found out the next year that most of those kids didn't actually succeed in the startups they found. Stop nodding. I know this for a fact because one of my friends also fucking failed out of his startup. This ruins lives because it means to devote several years of your life, a large proportion of your income into something that never actually constructs a generated good. Contrast this, though, with a traditional corporation. When you fail in a traditional corporation, you can quit, you can get fired, or you can receive a penalty. When you fail as a startup, you can get legal liability from the venture capitalist that was investing into you, and they can accuse you of not fulfilling your end of the contract. That, we believe, is so much more pernicious and toxic. The second extension I want to talk about, though, regardless of the impacts on the individual, are the impacts on the economy. We think this is the most important in the round because this is something that affects all people. Front half has conceded that the vast majority of the effects of startup culture are affecting only those with the privilege to, for example, have backgrounds in coding, or they have a lot of money already available to invest into these startups. We think macroeconomic harms, though, hurt every single person, not only in the developed world, but also in the developing world. Let's talk about startups inherently, then. We think that when there is a norm of startups that is promulgated, we create a norm of industry disruption. That is to say, we constantly want to break into industries and create these bubbles. Because what happens is that for every single story of Snapchat that you have, you also have 5 other stories that get failed, that gets a lot of hype, that gets a lot of investors investing into them, but the money doesn't go anywhere when the idea doesn't actually translate into real beneficial success. This problem is multiplied, though, by the unsustainable business practices that we see in startup culture. This is why, for example, Amazon, Netflix have continuously over their entire existences have invested in deficit spending. They spend more money than they have, with the continuous goal of expecting long-run returns. But when we know, again, you're out of order, that 95% of the startups don't actually succeed, we see tremendous amounts of dead weight loss because this is essentially them burning money, burning time, not actually achieving anything. And the startups that do succeed are still fucking awful. It is so bad that nearly 15% of server investments in the entire world are owned by Amazon. So when a startup does become successful, they become so systemically important that if Amazon were to crash, we would see massive macroeconomic repercussions that can't possibly be matched by the stability traditional corporations offer. Contrast this then with that stability. We think the problem that OWO has already recognized is that traditional corporations choose to poach startups most of the times, which means they spend less time and money in their own corporations encouraging innovation. Moreover, cross-apply what OG has already told you about how there's a lot of startup redundancy. This makes research significantly worse. On the counter-narrative, though, on the counterfactual, our side of the house has a long list of traditional corporations that have economies of scale, enabling them to best invest into the research and development and innovation OO prizes so dearly. Proud to propose.
Thank you, member of the government, for the speech. I'd like to invite member of the opposition to further analysis.
hilarious that all of government gets up and says, look, I think it's better that you invest your time in going to graduate school. Take a case example, because that'll get you jobs. You'll get an extra $100,000 million beyond your lifetime. In the US, African American women are literally the most educated group of women in the country. We have more associate's degrees, we have more bachelor's degrees, we even have more PhDs than any other woman in the country. We also have the lowest level of employment of women in the country. Realize that this is the problem that we are talking about. That we over and over again tell people that if you take a conservative career path, that it will work out. What they ignore is that there are systematic barriers, but also overall barriers that people experience that mean that $100 million that you think you're gonna get is not what everyone ends up getting. Actually, a lot of people end up screwed in your world because now they have a degree, they have $100,000 in debt as opposed to maybe $10,000 if you took a risk on a startup, right? There's a comparative value and worth that you end up taking in terms of that risk. And more importantly, now you have that degree and people are like, well, why can't you get a job, right? So that's the discussion that you end up having on your side of the house. Actually engage with what has happened in this debate. Before I go into my own speech, which is about infrastructures for entrepreneurial success, I have 3-ish points of rebuttal. Firstly, in terms, it's like 3.5. So firstly, and this is the 0.5 thing, is like, what are we talking about in terms of startup culture, right, and glorification, right? In some ways, yes, it is, look at the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, but realize that the extrapolation that you get from that is, I too might be able to have success, right? It's not just that, well, Mark Zuckerberg did it alone, and we're all a gung-ho team that we're gonna go forward into the night, right? Like, this is like, that you too might have the ability to have success at this thing, but more importantly, that if you do try and do this thing, that is a good thing, a positive thing to do in society. What that means is not just that more people end up attempting to do this thing, but we also think that other people are more willing to invest in other people's attempts to do this, right? This is why Kickstarter and the other one that the name I can never remember have so much success, right? Because we have seen a or Etsy or things like that have so much success. It's because the glorification of startup culture has also made investing and buying from and acting on startup culture a much more profitable, much more appealing thing. Then on failure, realize that the failure they're talking about is comparatively different to the failure that you end up getting from failing out of school, right? If you fail at a startup, yeah, you lost $10,000, you might have lost 2 years of your life. Cool, I'm so sorry that happened to you. If you fail at going to grad school, right, either you fail out or you get a degree and you cannot get a job, in some places that might be $50,000 to $100,000 of things lost. That might be 4 years of time lost, right? So the point at which that's true, we think that for a lot of people, the comparative risk of losing out on a startup in 1 year of your life is much, much worse than the comparative, much better than the comparative risk of losing out on like 3 or 4 years of your life. Then about like, and then more importantly, that like failure in terms of a startup doesn't mean the same thing as failure in terms of a job, right? You still signal that you have abilities and things that you can invest or things that you can provide, right? That likely within employers, like, holy, like God, this person is willing to like invest and think through things and be entrepreneurial, we like that thing. But realize that also a lot of their argumentation extends only to things in tech startups. We think there are smaller startups, things like subscription things, like Curlbox or Hue, which were created by black women to like be able to disperse mainly black like makeup, that like now has gotten a huge following because they were able to find a group of people that really didn't have access to the makeup and the things that they needed, that now have that at a more a much lower cost rate. But then on the harms of stability, engaging with that path. One, realize that it's not like the companies that they are talking about also don't end up failing, also don't have those harms. We actually prefer if there are multiple companies dealing with the same exact thing. Why? Because then when you have multiple Amazons, multiple companies like that, working on a similar thing, what you disperse is the risk of that failure, right? So you don't have the same types of risk of failure that you previously would front half.
You talk about the benefits of niche startups and small startups, but people have lives outside of their jobs. Why can't they pursue these things without the glorification of startup culture?
Bet you I'm about to answer that question. Cool. On to my point about the infrastructures of entrepreneurial success. For many years, there were lots of people with really great ideas or okay ideas that were trapped. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the time, they didn't have the infrastructure. These meant two things. One, it was very, very hard to create those ideas and work on those ideas. But two, the only people who could take that risk were people who had a lot of privilege to begin with, right? So when they say that startups will continue to exist, those startups will always be Mark Zuckerberg on their side of the house, right? So this is bad for two reasons. The first reason is it limits access to those who are already shut out of the job market, right? Their world limits that access. But two, more endeavors end up failing on their side of the house. Why? How does glorification change this? Firstly, we think that it does increase the number of startups that exist. We think that glorification does, I'm not going to lie. But what we also think it does is it creates, in doing so, creates an infrastructure that surrounds startup culture. What do we mean by this? Firstly, is the creation of physical spaces, so like space sharing that currently exists where you can physically go to a place and be able to work there. What this ends up doing is one, it makes you look like a real company, but two, it means that you end up being able to share and communicate ideas and things like that. Another thing that has come up around startup culture is things like crowdfunding, right? That's mainly where we got it from, but also things like consulting firms for startups. We think that this comes directly from that cultural glorification, right? This because it's not now just something that we support, but something that we actively want to invest in, actively want to be involved in as a society writ large, right? So we create the infrastructure surrounding that. What is the impact of this? In the short term, the costs and the risks for people end up going down to invest in a startup, try a startup. But two, we think that fewer startups end up failing because of that infrastructure, because of that space. But three, that startups become more widely accessible. But even if none of those things happen, we think there are benefits that people have reaped from that infrastructure that are not included, right? So when they say, can you start something on your off time? Now you can, because you have websites like Etsy, you have websites like Kickstarter. Those don't exist unless you glorify startup culture enough to the point where you want to invest in it. Look, startup culture has meant a change of life for millions and millions of people. Even if you end up failing, I promise you the failure is far less than that, where if you went to school and realized that you didn't want to become a doctor. For those reasons, I am so proud to oppose.
Thank you, member of the opposition for the debate. The likely by Councilman Wilson, refer pronounced.
Everybody good? Three big things: how this glamorization affects the economy, how it affects individuals, how it trickles over into other industries, a bunch of rebuttal to mostly the extension will be integrated into this. So firstly, broadly on this question of how it affects the economy, I think the big question is what startups exist, who chooses to make a startup in a world in which we don't have the sort of radical glorification of startups that exists in this status quo. The first thing I want to talk about is to sort of disabuse what I think is a disingenuous notion coming out of the opposition bench, that when we glorify startups and we talk about the glorification of startup culture, we are discussing the people who started small businesses in rural areas and supplied services that were previously not there for them. When we talk about the glorification of startup culture, what we are overwhelmingly talking about are people like Mark Zuckerberg, are people like Bill Gates, are individuals who are seen as the capitalists who have led themselves into the future, who have changed the world around them. I think comparatively, when people are thinking about what has been glamorized, what has been seen to be the best, that is certainly the more important part. So I want to distinguish. Somebody starting a new small business that does something maybe slightly more efficiently, like for example providing food or opening a supermarket in an area that's a food desert, is probably not the person who saw the glorification of startups. They're rather someone who saw probably glorification of business to some degree, but people have been starting businesses for centuries, and it has not required this glamorization of startups to do that. I'll take back half.
The problem with this argument is realize that people who start tech businesses, the Mark Zuckerbergs, already come from money, are already intelligent. Those are the kind of people who do startups on either side of the house because they don't need it to be glorified in order to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're saying is that in the vast majority of instances, doing a startup is a bad idea. Starting a small business, if you actually have a business plan and can secure capital, might not be. Why is this distinction important? Is what's the clarification there? We think that we would rather a world in which accessing capital in order to start a small business is something that needs to justify a business plan. You can't just show up with an algorithm. You can't just show up with a website. We think lots of people will still start businesses in our world, but that it will not be something that is seen as the best way to get ahead, the best way, especially in relatively risky fields like tech. I'll get to probably after this point. So we think, broadly speaking, that we're still going to have startups, that yes, probably less money will go to startups and more investment money will go to big firms, and those big firms will hire people using that money because they want to expand their operations, but that comparatively the startups that remain are those that had really good business plans, or those that were likely to succeed. So we think that yes, we're still going to have startups, but the proportion of them that succeed will be much higher because you will have far fewer that had no business plan. Because the reality of the circumstance is that running a business is exceptionally hard, and it requires skills across a wide variety of areas. What we think is that the status quo glamorization of this sort of culture has indicated that if you have this one really good idea, the idea that if you have the idea of Facebook, you can start the firm. We think that's almost certainly, in almost every case, simply not true, and that you are far more likely statistically to fail because you lack accounting skills, you lack managerial skills, etc., etc. We would rather you go towards a firm in order to do that. Yeah.
The weighing that we gave you up top was that the glorification of school and traditional jobs already existed before. This glorification has neutralized that comparison and made the choice more free, so people are much better able to weigh the risks while mutually reinforcing each other.
Yeah, so what we're saying is that the risks are being massively undervalued by virtue of the startup culture, of the glamorization, right? Because you see a couple that succeed, and as an average citizen, you hear almost nothing about the ones that fail, which means you think that even if it's like you think you have a 50% shot at succeeding, you think you have a 75% shot at succeeding, you are still dramatically undervaluing the risk of failure, and in as far as you're doing that, we think it's more likely that you make the wrong decision. It's not like, yes, it is more free, you are more likely to go to a startup in their world, we're telling you that's a bad idea. So, second thing, how does this affect the economy writ large? This is our extension, and I actually think it's far and away the most important thing in the round. What we told you is that when you glamorize this kind of culture, when you say, this business will change everything because I just started it, people are willing to tolerate these businesses being loss-making for far longer. They are willing to tolerate them having shoddy business plans for far longer. This is how Uber, as long as it's existed, has literally lost billions of dollars every year. There is no reason to believe that Uber is so much more efficient than taxis that it is going to be profitable in the long run. Taxis can also build an app. In as far as this is the case, we've created an environment that is broadly tolerant of this kind of extended loss making. This is why Amazon also has never made a profit. We think this, combined with the fact that these are frequently disruptive technological industries, has led to a tolerance in the broader capital markets for the kind of risk that we see in a firm like Amazon controlling something like 30 or 40% of all global server space. If Amazon goes down, if Amazon continues to not make a profit and eventually investors pull out, we see the real possibility of real global economic implications. Why is this the most important issue in the round? Because the relative question of how an individual makes a decision about where they go or how an individual considers their net worth is a smaller magnitude implication than the possibility that if Amazon goes down and you lose all of that server hosting space, you lose meaningful confidence in global financial markets because that server space was what caused those markets to function, and without it you end up with the credit crunch, etc., etc. This is literally the process we saw in 2008 that led to the crash. Why? Because people lost confidence in markets. I think the underlying problem here is that this risk tolerance allows not just for those direct crashes, but also for the fact that these companies, which are still loss-making, being valued at hundreds of billions of dollars, crashing, getting everyone involved in them fired, and having people end up out of work. That is a bigger scale impact than anything else that's been discussed in this round and hasn't gotten refuted. Second, we think there's massive inefficiency in the allocation of capital in the economy, which again means people who could get jobs aren't, where they say, well, we'd rather have that risk dispersed amongst startups. What we've told you is that that risk isn't dispersed amongst startups because at best one of them succeeds. Probabilistically, none of the three companies that they're discussing coming out of the extension succeed, which ends up meaning that it's the case that you don't get success. The last thing here is the sort of like line that's coming out of opposition in terms of the economy about innovation. The suggestion is that like long-run plans stop innovation. No, long-run plans are central to innovation. You need to do the basic research before you can get to the next levels. We'd rather have planned research rather than massive amounts of overlapping research, which again wastes money and means people aren't getting hired with that money. Then we get the idea that there's complacency in big firms, so like people don't work as hard. We think people are afraid of being fired in big firms in the same way as they are in a startup, and also continue to work hard. So comparatively, we get similar amounts of innovation, but it's more effectively utilized in our house. Briefly on the discussion of individuals and how it affects other jobs. So we get the suggestion that this advances equity in hiring, the like glorification of startup culture. Two kinds of problems with this. First, the examples that we get of like very small companies are probably still possible to succeed because if they had a sustainable business model and they went with that, they could still do those things. We don't think you need the glamorization of startup culture at large. But second, we would rather, even if we lose a couple of those companies, have less people end up out of work. So this is the risk calculus that we're getting. The suggestion we're getting is that it is a similar risk To go to college and not get a job and to start a startup. No. Getting to college, on average, has a positive return. Starting a startup, on average, has a negative return. A huge negative return. Comparatively, we would rather more people do the former than the latter. We're not just talking about grad school, we're talking about the startup culture that has told people they shouldn't even go to undergrad and has hurt people in that. We think this leads to people making bad decisions. We think it leads to them when they fail, because they will fail, feeling worse about themselves because they thought I couldn't be that person at the very top, and it ends up slipping over into other businesses because the tolerance for ridiculous hours also forces other firms to do the same. We're proud to propose.
Thank you, Dr. Witt. The light by Officer Witt is member Hernandez.
Two huge problems coming from closing government. Largely they have to do with engagement. What Camara tells you is that glorification also applies to the consumer, that I as a consumer, because I do things like appreciate Mark Zuckerberg, am more likely to do things like be an investor on Kickstarter, more likely to do things buy from startups. The second is what Camara tells you in what I POI, that this likely doesn't have to do with the tech sector. The kinds of people who can build computers, the kinds of people who can program, are the kind of rich people who are going to be doing startups on either side of the house. What we're actually talking about today are the average citizens who might not be willing to start a startup, who might not be willing to take the risk that exists to get their product out there. Whether that be a new kind of jam, whether that be a new kind of boombox, any sort of thing, right? We think that the tech sector is largely awash in this debate. Third problem that we have coming from them is they largely don't have to deal with the argument that comes from Camara as to why loans are more likely on their side of the house, why investment from hedge funds are particularly problematic on their side of the house. I have two questions today. The first one is, when is it glorified and for who? And the second one being, how do we get better success on our side of the house through the institutions that we create, and what are the spin-offs because of that? First question, when is it glorified and for who? Realize that if you have a good idea and you're wealthy, if you have skills, then there's very little risk on either side of the house for you to now begin a startup. What this means is the kinds of things that they want to talk about up and down the bench, the kinds of tech industries, the kinds of Facebooks, right? Like Mark Zuckerberg wasn't poor, he was going to Harvard, right? We think that those kinds of things then mean that either side of the house is the tech ones that are starting. What this means then is that this takes place for individuals where there's a large financial cost, when it might be better then to just go and get a job somewhere who they might not be able to go to college, they might not be able to go to grad school. We think that that's the comparative that actually takes place. So if you're talking about investment then, it's whether or not you risk doing things like doing a startup or the alternative, which is not college, but probably just means working for an extra 4 years, working for an extra 2 years. We say that on our side of the house, it's going to be better then. Why? Because even if the startup fails, this means that you now have something on your CV that you wouldn't otherwise. It allows you to obtain something that you might be able to get from a master's degree, but obtain it through your own hard work. We tell you that a failure is actually a good thing on either side of the house. But more importantly, how do we get better success? What's the extension here coming from Camara, and why is it important? The first thing to realize in response to OG is that it's very difficult for individuals to do both. It's very difficult for you to do things like start a startup while also working a traditional job for the exact reason that CG gives, right? You have to devote a lot of time, you have to devote a lot of energy, oftentimes your work takes up a lot of time, which means that you're unable to do things like actually work on your startup, you forget about it, it becomes a midlife crisis later on. We think that's the kinds of problems then, that the actual intellectual sort of existential problems that come from not actually being able to fulfill your idea, not being able to do it. We think that is oftentimes worse because it leaves that what if question. We say that even if you fail, it either means that maybe your idea wasn't good enough, and while that might be disappointing, at the very least, you know that you have your answer. We think that's beneficial on either side of the house. But secondly, what is the kinds of things that come out of this? Realize that because startups have been glorified, there's been lots of people now who want to do things like invest in them. There's lots of people now which allow for things like GoFundMe and Kickstarter to begin, that allow for things like shared spaces to begin, that allow for more collaboration, more cooperation. We tell you that insofar as that's true, it's done things like lower the actual risk to individual entrepreneurs. Why is this important? Because the kinds of huge economic harms that they're talking about on their side of the house are probably more likely to happen on their side of the house. we probably don't think that the case we hear coming from CG is going to happen at all. So basically, like, it kind of looks like the housing market bubble, so like the economy is probably going to fail, right? Like, we don't think that's likely going to happen on either side of the house, but we do think that likely the problems with debt might come to fruition. So why is this more likely to happen on their side of the house? Realize, because if I can rely on things like Kickstarter and the kinds of infrastructure that has developed from the glorification, then this means then that there's very little cost to me, but it also means that there's very little cost for the consumer. Because if I can give $25 and I know if it doesn't raise the cap of like $20,000 or whatever, then I'll get my money back, then it means that the investor, there's very little cost to the investor and very little cost to the person who's beginning the startup now. This means that you don't have to do things like rely on the loans from hedge funds that they're talking about. Because when that's money lost, they're correct, that money is lost. What this means then is the kind of bubble that they're worried about is more likely to happen on their side of the house. We tell you that's the kind of risk then that has to happen. They have to rely more on loans. We tell you that glorification has applied to the consumer and has allowed now the consumer to also get involved in these startups. That's a good thing, and we're very happy about that. But what's the other problem that they have to deal with on their side of the house, right? Because realize that the kinds of glorification problems they have about individuals means that because college has long been the kind of path that you need to success, that it means that the path to success has been cut off from a lot of people. We tell you now that you're able to do things like prioritize your skills in a way that you wouldn't be able to do so otherwise. Before I go on, I'll take back half.
Cool. The past 2 minutes of your speech mirrors the exact thinking of investors before the dot-com bubble burst. They also saw an increase in investors. They also saw an increase in the amount of money in the industry. What are the arguments you have given that leads us to think that this could be different?
The kind of investing that side-closing government is talking about is when you go to a bank and you take out a loan. The kind of investing that happens from the infrastructure that's been created is an individual person will give $200 of their dollars. The difference is their money is lost if that startup fails. If my startup that I invest in does not get the $20,000 it needs on Kickstarter, that money is returned to me. That means that there's lower cost to the investor on our side of the house, which doesn't lead to the kind of bubble that they're talking about. Realize that's the kinds of loans that they have to take out on their side of the house. But secondly, even more importantly, the fact now that I have to rely on consumers to tell me if my idea is good or not will mean that I might not now create my company if I don't get enough investors, right? So now we tell you that there's less risk of like you might just stop doing your startup insofar as you don't get enough investors, insofar as consumers aren't interested in enough. This means that we can preempt stopping bad ideas from coming to fruition, whereas on their side of the house they take out massive loans and then those ideas fail miserably. But most importantly, Camara also tells you that there are things like outside impacts. Insofar now as this infrastructure also applies to like GoFundMe campaigns, and I can do things like now rely on my neighbors and things to make sure that I don't get kicked out of my apartment. But this kind of infrastructure not only helps entrepreneurs, but also helps the general public as well. We tell you that kind of spin-off is also beneficial, and another reason why you're going to provide support opposition to this debate. Look, we think the kinds of absurd economic impacts and the kind of existential impacts coming from opening government and closing government are widely overstated. We think there are tangible benefits both to the investor and to the entrepreneur, and for those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.